bienvenidos a todos a la quinta sesión, aunque esta vez hay muy poca diferencia entre la quinta y la sexta sesión por problemas técnicos y al final que aprovechamos cuando vienen los profesores visitantes para dar los talleres y bueno, pues está de esta manera. Hoy tenemos el placer de contar con el profesor visitante Pavel Zemliansky, con un taller titulado Writing Academic Article, Necessary Knowledge and Skills for a Thesis by Publication. Y posteriormente tendremos la ponencia del compañero Víctor Caleya, quien nos hablará sobre la creatividad como competencia fundamental en la educación superior. El objetivo de hoy es que nos brinden herramientas prácticas para la redacción de artículos académicos, así como a reflexionar sobre la importancia de la creatividad en el ámbito universitario y su relación con el compromiso en la aprendizaje. Ahora mismo comenzamos con el taller de 2 horas de Pavel, el cual está diseñado para, el cual nos, además de lo que es ofrecemos una serie de estrategias, nos ofrecerá un taller colaborativo, que nos será de 2 partes, una parte un poco más breve y teórica acerca de lo que conlleva, ¿no?, escribir en inglés artículos por compendio, y una segunda parte donde ponemos en práctica algunas estrategias que nos enseñará durante la sesión. Decir que Pavel Zemliansky es experto en escritura académica, retórica y comunicación profesional. He is accomplished academic in the field of English and rhetoric. He earned his PhD in English from Florida State University in 2002, with a dissertation titled Genuine Tradition in Academic Discourse or an Artificial Construct, reconsidering the past, present, and future of the college research.
Did I send you this, or did you find it somewhere else? Sorry.
Huh?
Did I send you this?
You sent us the CD, and we write
I forgot already what I sent
you. He also holds an MA in English from Appalachia State University and BA in Linguistics.
A long time ago.
Translation and interpretation from the National Caleya University, Spain, with a minor in French. Dr. Zemliansky is currently a full professor at Oslo Met and has held various academic positions at institutions such as the University of Central Florida and James Madison University. He has extensive teaching experience, including courses in academic writing, oral communication, international journal publishing, and more. He has supervised several PhD students and has published numerous books and peer-reviewed journal articles. His notable works include Critiquing Post-Soviet Rhetoric, Internet-Based Workplace Communication, and Directing Space Series. Le damos la bienvenida y le cedemos la...
Hola, yo hablo un poco de español, pero es no suficiente para enseñar en español, so nosotros hablamos inglés. Okay? So the introduction was great, thank you very much, Vanessa, and this is like way more than I'd ever heard about myself. Thank you all for coming to this session. This is a version of this. I teach a course at Oslo Met, which lasts a whole semester, the PhD students, and we meet for about 30 hours, and it's a very sort of large, expanded course, but this is a very condensed 2-hour version of that course, basically. And the purpose today is to sort of talk about some really foundational ideas about what academic writing is, how it works, and how you can apply some of these ideas to your own projects. But again, because we have so little time, it's going to be quite basic, really. Some of these ideas you probably heard about before, and some of them will probably sound really strange to you. So, bear with me. I think sort of hearing new stuff and strange stuff is a good way to work. The way I like to teach is I don't like to talk for long periods of time because I'm not, who wants to hear me talk for an hour? Nobody. So what we'll do is I'll give you some information and then we'll do a little activity. So you can kind of talk to each other a little bit and sort of discuss some stuff, and then I'll tell you more and we'll discuss again. So that's sort of, and the online people, hello. I didn't really know that there would be an online presence, but welcome. Anyway, you're all here, surprise, yeah. So, and also like in addition to what Vanessa said during the presentation, English is not my first language. I'm from Ukraine, and I learned English over many years, writing, reading, speaking, working. And actually, in my brain right now, there's a horrible mix of languages. I almost answered somebody in Norwegian yesterday. And I was like, no, I should not be doing that. So, and I'm telling you this because one idea that I wanted to begin with is that when you're writing an academic work in another language, such as English in your case, you really should not worry about your language proficiency. It's not about the language. It's not about vocabulary, it's not about grammar, it's not about how well you can speak English, it's not about that at all. The principles of academic writing, which we'll talk about today, go across languages. They are the same in Spanish, English, German, Chinese, whatever. So a lot of times PhD students come sort of with this fear that, oh, my English isn't good enough, so I cannot do this work. You can. Getting your English proficiency up takes a long time, as we'll discuss, and it's not something you can do quickly, but you can start doing other things. Even if you think that your English isn't great, you can do this, right? So, like I said, maybe I'll tell you a little anecdote later about how I moved to the US to go to a master's program when I was younger. And I remember having to write my first academic paper in English. My English was fine. I could speak it, I could understand it. But it was a terrifying experience because I did not know academic English, right? I did not know what moves I needed to make academically in order to sound like an academic writer, essentially. And so your task right now is not to worry about, is my English good enough? Your task is to develop the ability to, what we call make rhetorical moves that sound like academic English. That's like a whole different language, basically. Because the English you use in the street or wherever you speak it or write it or whatever is going to be different from academic. And even if you did this in Spanish, the way you talk to your friends and family in Spanish would be very different from the way you talk in Spanish in academic writing. That's something that we need to understand when we talk about it. So, I love this chair, you can just glide around. So we're going to talk first about, normally when people teach these kinds of workshops, they start by saying, well, here's what an academic article looks like, here's how you put it together. We'll talk about that, but I wanted to begin with something else. I think talking about the writing process and how to manage the task, because you all come into this program and you're told you need to write 3 articles, right? 3?
Yeah.
And you have how many years to do that?
4.
4. And you go, oh my God, this is just so much, right? And so difficult. How do I do that? So I think it's very important for us to talk about, like, here are some of the things you can do in practical terms to actually manage this process and not freak out. But people burn out, people freak out and they quit because they don't know how to manage all this. So, and this comes out of a theory sort of that's been around for about, 70 years now, called the process theory. Have you guys heard about the writing process? Have you heard the phrase writing process? So you kind of revision, that sort of thing, right? You don't just, the basic point is this, you don't just sit down and write something and submit, okay? It doesn't work like that. You cannot just say, I'm gonna plan it all in my head, and then when I'm done planning, I can sit down and write it up and send it in. Writing does not work this way. It's very important to understand. So what we're going to talk about, okay, this is something that sort of is a little difficult to understand sometimes.
Pavel,
Yeah.
sorry for interrupt. Can you sit down?
Oh, yeah, so that the online people can
Next
see.
to the
Sorry, online
microphone?
people. I'm
Because
sorry.
everybody's saying that
Yeah.
your voice
Yeah.
sounds
Sorry.
far.
Okay, so the first thing that we need to kind of consider and understand and try to comprehend is that writing is not a demonstration of learning. In secondary school, very often teachers ask students to write something after they've learned it, supposedly. So you would learn something by reading about it or by talking about it, then you say, okay, now write me an essay, write me a paper about what you've learned. That's what we don't want at our level, okay? What we do want instead is thinking about writing as a means of learning, right? The word I'll use in a minute is fluency. You guys heard about fluency? Being fluent means being good at something without kind of thinking about it too much, right? So you could be fluent in languages or in like a hobby or sports or music or whatever it is. Fluency is this ability to kind of do things without like obsessing over them. So I want you to begin thinking about writing as a means of getting fluent in your subject. Whatever you're researching, whatever you're studying, the subject matter. How can you become better at your subject through writing? Not through reading, not through lectures, through writing. How can we use writing to actually become more fluent in the research topic that we're dealing with? Because we're really, if you look at a paper and it's a bad paper, it's not because the writer does not have the vocabulary or the grammar. It is usually because the writer does not understand the subject very well enough to convey it in a way that's readable, that's useful, right? So that's why before we even talk about language, before we talk about grammar, before we talk about vocabulary, words, whatever, we need to talk about how do we become good at, fluent at the content of the research that we're trying to do. Okay? And again, the traditional way is, of course, to say, well, go read some articles, right? Go to Google Scholar or whatever, and download some articles, read them. And that's fine. But as I'll be saying, you need to begin writing early as possible. One thing that I think people are doing very often is they kind of walk around for a year and read, and they say to themselves, I'm going to read 300 articles this year, and I'm going to sort of put it all in here, download them into my head, right? And then when I've learned all this stuff for reading, then I'll begin writing, because I'll be ready. That's exactly the wrong approach. Begin writing early, right? So that, let me go back. Oh, taking me forward for some reason. Why am I going forward when I go back? Sorry, online people too. How do I get back? Sorry, Melissa. Yeah, oh yeah, that's good. Yeah, let's get, okay, sorry. So think about like, how can you use writing to not just communicate what you already know, but to become better at whatever it is that you're researching. By the way, what fields do we have represented here? What are you guys' topics? What are your sort of interests, research areas that you're working in?
Vocational counseling.
Okay, cool. Anybody else?
Music,
huh? Interesting.
health.
Health, okay, cool. Right, so all these things, again, you could go and read for a year, but I can guarantee you that if you do that and then you say, now I'm gonna start writing, it's not gonna go well. Because you're passively kind of trying to absorb some knowledge, and when you're writing about it, you're actively learning, okay? However, here's my favorite quote about writing. There's no quick fix. It's hard and it takes long. It is hard. You develop some skills and it becomes a little easier when you get more experience, but it never really becomes easy. It's hard and it takes a long time. But when we talk about the long time, we mean exactly that you need to make time to develop your thinking and develop your fluency and develop the process. It's not just a way of sitting down and transcribing, writing down what you know here. It's developing what you know here through writing. Make sense, kind of?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So that's a very foundational idea that I need you to kind of begin thinking in these kinds of terms, okay? So, on the left side there, it says writing is not just communication of content, it is the creation and articulation of that content. So here's an example. When you begin writing an article and you kind of think about like, all right, well, I have some general idea about what I want to do. I have some very vague idea, but I'm not really sure where it's going to go, what my research question will be. I don't really know very much about the subject matter yet. Right? You could do one of two things, as I said already. You could either sort of go read and try to memorize a bunch of things, or you could open a file on your computer and say, right now I'm thinking this, just kind of like write a paragraph and say, right now I'm thinking of this topic, I'm thinking of this question, here's what I know, and here's what I think about it right now, right? And you write a paragraph or two. And of course, the point here is not to produce publishable text. Those paragraphs are not going to be publishable. You will not be able to say, here's my thing. But what that allows you to do is to begin thinking through what you think you know, what you think you understand actively by by doing this. And then what you would do, you would read through it and say, okay, well, let's say I realize that I have a gap somewhere that I don't know much about something, right? Then you can go read about it. Then you come back to your paragraphs and you add the new stuff that you learned. And by that point, I can almost guarantee you that if you look at the original paragraphs, you will begin thinking about some of that stuff differently as well, because now you know more. And you will create more text that way. And you would be amazed if you did this for a couple of weeks. By the end of the second week, you'll probably have about 10 pages written. If you do this every day for like 30 minutes, literally. So that's like almost an article already. It's a draft. It's not a finished article, but it's a first draft. So starting early, writing a little bit at a time. Don't binge. Like, don't say, Friday is my writing day, I'm gonna write all day on Friday. You won't. Never. Life interferes, things come up. It's not going to happen. So set aside 30 minutes a day where you could do some typing. And you would be amazed how much you can actually do in 30 minutes if you're not checking your email or social media or talking to your friends, right? So as you do that, realize that if you don't know something, that's normal. You could just even say, I need to read more about this, type it up and say, I need to look up some research about topic X or question X or whatever. And then go do some research, come back and write it up, expanding your text. So what you're doing then is you're developing your fluency on your topic, on your question, becoming better at knowing about it. So at this stage, I don't want you to think about writing as communication. You're not communicating to anyone. You're communicating with yourself in a way. You're trying to sort of develop your thoughts, your thinking, your understanding of something. Don't worry about your audience here, just yourself. So this is sort of like a very kind of a basic idea that I think a lot of it is a sort of mindset, like how do we think about this rather than what do we do? Like how do we approach this task rather than like, what's my article going to look like in 3 months? We don't want to worry about that just yet. You all heard about Stephen King? Okay, so he's got a little book which is actually kind of fun, called On Writing, and he talks about his writing process. His thing is he wakes up at 5 in the morning every day. And he says his goal for the day is to write 10 pages. They're not publishable pages, so they're not going to all end up in a short story. His goal is to generate 10 pages of some kind of text. Ideas, thoughts, maybe some storylines. And he says, and I'm done by 9 o'clock usually because it takes me about 4 hours to write 10 pages. Then I have the rest of my day to do whatever I want. Then next day I can go back and look at whatever it is and sort of expand it and revise it and stuff. So that's even when you write fiction, that seems to be a good method. But research is a particularly good method. So think about it this way. Any questions or sort of like, have you tried this before maybe, or have you seen anybody try this before, or?
Yeah, I feel like I'm doing it without knowing more or less, because when I write, I always have this thought coming and saying, is this correct in English? Like, always this interpretation. Right. And at some point, I just stopped checking the grammar all the time, exactly. Because it didn't allow me to write.
Right. Exactly.
So I just write, and then when I'm done, I check.
Right. But see, at this stage, you don't even need to worry about grammar. Yeah. You don't. You could even write it in Spanish, really, at this point, because the purpose is not to produce a polished English text. At this stage, the purpose is to develop your knowledge about whatever it is that you're writing about. Nobody, even like the most experienced researcher, nobody sits down and says, I know exactly everything about what I need to say, and I'm just going to write it down. It does not work this way. You always begin a project with some level of uncertainty about the question, about some level of uncertainty about what needs to go in there, what needs to stay out, how do I think about my questions. This is all, if you approach writing as a way to develop your thinking, instead of just communicating what you're thinking, not worrying about language, I think that's what we're talking about here. By the way, another thing that's really kind of interesting now is that you can talk to your phone, You can sort of dictate things to your phone without worrying too much about like structure or what it looks like, and then you can download the file and have it transcribed. Ask your ChatGPT friend to transcribe it for you, and you'll have text. And then you can work with the text further. So there are all these little things that you can do, like when you go for a run or when you walk your dog or whatever, talk to your phone. People complain about not having time, I mean, that's very real. But you can do little things half an hour a day. I think it's very important. So developing fluency, big deal. Let's see. All right, so like if you think about anything you're good at, like let's say you're good at playing a musical instrument or something, you didn't get there in one day, right? It took sort of a long time, and it took going back and forth, and it took trying different things, and maybe thinking like I've learned something, but like then you realize that you didn't actually learn it, so you have to go back and relearn it because there's more to it. It's the same thing with writing. You didn't just wake up one day and say, I'm now 100% good at this, and there's nothing else for me to learn. It doesn't exist. Okay. So, so I began talking a little bit about this. When you start a project, you may have like a really vague idea about something. Yeah? Not just you, me too, everyone. And so the important thing to do here would be to sort of like not worry about kind of thinking about it too much, but to begin writing, as I said. As humans, the only way to kind of develop knowledge that we have is language, really. We cannot communicate telepathically with one another, it's all language. And so when you are developing some kind of new knowledge, use the language to do that. It does not matter which language at this point. You could write it in your first language, you could write it in your second language, third, fourth, whatever, it does not matter. At this point, the point is not to have language. The point is to develop knowledge, whatever language it takes. And so you can start with some really basic draft, which attempts to explain or describes this sort of like vague ideas or imperfect idea that you have, because you're not yet fluent in it. You might say, well, I'm kind of interested in this research question, but I'm not really sure how to express it so that it makes sense. Write it down the way you think it makes sense to you now. Whatever it looks like now. Write it down, save it, then read more, talk to people, show them the question, what do you think about this? Go back and then refine it further. So fluency is developed through writing multiple drafts. On average, I'm not obviously a large enough sample, but I think on average it takes me about 4 to 5 drafts to produce something that I can actually even send to a journal. And after that, they make me revise more. So I'm talking about maybe 7 or 8 drafts when I will until done, really. And by draft, I don't mean like a 20-page draft, but sometimes you start with like a page or a paragraph or half a page, and then you extend. And at this point, again, you're not just trying to create a better text. That's really important. You're trying to create a better version of the knowledge and fluency of the product. So at this point, at this stage, it's not about what is my article going to look like in 3 months. Don't worry about it. This is not about that. Okay, so back to the writing process is kind of connected. This weird little picture kind of represents what we go through when we write. These people did research on this many years ago, and they kind of figured out that this is how the human brain tends to approach the writing task in these kinds of stages in the whole through it. And I like this way. Sometimes you see this represented as a line, like from point A to point B. But I don't like that because it implies that this process is very organized and very orderly, and that you just go in a straight line and you're done. When in fact, it's a lot more messy, right? And I like this, the roundabouts that we drive around. I like this also because you can get off the roundabout at any time. And if you need to go back, you can go back and drive around another circle. So basically, this breaks down the whole task of writing your text into these stages, where you might begin with, this is a little bit, understanding the ideas, collecting, note-taking, brainstorming, doing preliminary work that is required in order to, at some point, eventually create a finished thing. Right? So you plan, you do your whole, like, some people like to write outlines, for example. Do we have any outline phonetics here? No? Some people like to just take notes, write lists, right? There's a little technique called free writing where you just basically sit down and you tell yourself, I'm gonna write for 5 minutes. I'm not going to worry about structure, correctness. I'm not going to check myself. I'm not going to edit myself. I'm just going to produce text, essentially, 5 minutes. And then beyond that, you can say, now I've written something in 5 minutes. I have a sentence that I really like here. I'm going to work with that idea, and I'm going to write about that idea for another 5 minutes. And if you do several rounds of that, you will find that all of a sudden, miraculously, magically, you've written 3 pages. How did that happen? So then you can sort of move to a more formal drafting process where you say to yourself at this stage, like right now, okay, I'm going to produce some version of my complete text, maybe. Or you might say, I'm going to produce some version of my introduction, my literature review. Let's say your goal at this point becomes to sort of produce 5 pages or something of literature review, with the understanding that it's not going to be finished, it's not going to be publishable, it's a beginning, right? A draft. Then you'll look at what you've written, reflect on it, and I think this is a really good time right here to show it to somebody, to a friend, to a colleague, maybe to your supervisor, but maybe not yet, because supervisors tend to like things that are a bit more finished. So at this stage, I think it's good for you to get together with a fellow PhD student and sort of say, let's talk about what we're doing here. Actually, I really believe in study groups. I sound like an elementary school teacher, but I think study groups are fantastic. If you just go to a coffee shop somewhere with your stuff and read together what you've written and talk about what you've written, you'll be amazed what you can sort of figure out together. So keep that in mind. So show it to a peer, right? Person like yourself, and try to talk about it. Just kind of like say, hey, I'm working on this question. I have some questions about like what I'm thinking, like what do you think I should do here? How do you think I should approach learning more about this? What do I need to read? Do you know any articles that are really good? Do you know any other people who've written good stuff about this topic? Can you recommend something? Just have a conversation about it. Take notes, and then you can get here, which is revision, where you go to your text and you try to change it based on the feedback that you've received. But yet still at this point, you're not worrying about correctness or style or language really. You may want to begin thinking about some structure perhaps at this point, where you might say, well, here's how I'm going to organize my thoughts here. So you may want to begin doing that. But the main objective here is still knowledge generation, knowledge development. Let me ask you something. In your field of study, what is a typical structure of a research article? Is it IMRAD, Introduction, Methods, Result, Discussion? Or is it something else?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
Okay, so there is this thing called IMRAD, Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion.
Oh, okay.
It's like this.
So some fields use that structure, other fields use other structures. What is your typical kind of structure in your field?
It's like this one.
Right, okay. Yeah, so that's sort of like, it's not a formula, but it's sort of very kind of neat. You can sort of plug things in. So at this point, like when you get here, you can think, you can decide like, I'm gonna begin organizing my things around the IMRAD, for example. Right? Now is a good time to begin doing that. That doesn't mean that you cannot go back and change stuff, of course, but it will give you a sense of sort of like, now I'm actually writing an article, as opposed to just putting things together as a bunch of notes. And that's a good feeling, okay? So, so like at this point, you may realize, for example, that you need some more research, more knowledge, more ideas. In which case you will go back and kind of read more or talk to somebody or whatever. And then you go around the circle again. I mean, you can go around the circle as many times as you need. It's not a one-time thing. You can go around it 10 times or 5 times or whatever. At some point, though, you get to a point where you realize, I'm kind of done. There's nothing else I can develop here, so it's time for me to begin editing and proofreading. And this is now, and only now, where you can begin kind of thinking about, like, what does my language sound like? Am I being clear? Is it understandable? And guys, like, everybody is complaining about ChatGPT, but it's actually quite decent at editing. It's not good at writing cold text because it cannot think about context and audience, but it's actually pretty good at correcting the language. Or Grammarly, or whatever you want to use. So this is the time when you can begin kind of worrying about dressing things up and making it sound finished towards the end of the process, but not before. And then you're done. And probably at some point, maybe like after a couple of times of going through the circle, you may want to show it to your supervisor, of course. All right, so so we talked about the process a little bit, and again, this is very quick and very kind of superficial enough. But the next thing I wanted you to consider is, and this sounds like a really silly question, like what is academic writing? Well, we've all seen it, we all kind of know what it looks like, right? But what I want you to think about, what I want us all to think about is this, and this is really busy, but I want you to think about what you're doing as a social process, basically, that again, you're not alone. This is not about creating a text so much as interacting with other people through text. I teach a lot of engineering students and they like the word interface. Like interface, computers, machines, right? So I tell them, think about writing as an interface through which you connect with other people. So if you look at this very busy picture, you will see that the documents and the genres, which are the kinds of writing documents, they are in the middle of these interactions between writers, us, and our readers, right? And so in order for us to create an effective document that works, we need to understand and keep in mind things like, what is our purpose? What are we doing with this text? What am I trying to solve? Am I trying to solve a problem, answer a question, raise a question? What am I doing here in this particular piece of writing? It's not just about saying this paper is about topic X. That's not a very good question to ask. A better question to ask is, what is this paper trying to do? Research writing usually solves problems, answers questions, provides solutions. That's what we're trying to do. So we need to think about that. We also need to understand who our readers are. I have a funny story. When I was applying to PhD programs a long time ago, one of the programs wanted a writing sample from me. So I sent them a paper I had written in a master's class, and I was really proud of that paper. And I was thinking this is a really decent piece of writing. Well, they sent me a very polite rejection email saying, very politely, that their program would not be a good fit for me. And I was like, all right. So then I realized that the paper I sent them cited and quoted every person they hate in that program. All the writers, all the researchers that I had cited, they were basically fighting them because their school of thought was completely different. People who worked in that PhD program did not think about these problems the same way. So what happened, I did not understand readers. I did not think, is this going to go over well with this audience? And unfortunately, when you're working with journals, you will occasionally see some self-important person ask you to cite people or talk about people or mention the people who they like just because they like them. That's the nature of the game, unfortunately. But you need to understand that they probably have some reason for that. You need to understand who your readers are. On the other side, you have the readers, and they come in with their influences, their values, their interests. They want something. They come with their purpose. Like when I'm reading a research article, nobody reads these things for fun, right? We don't. We read them because we want something out of them. We want some very practical, very kind of precise reason why we read them. We want them to use in our own research, for example. So we need to understand that. And then there's this, which is kind of funny because that's why I think we have blind peer review, so they don't know who you are, right? So they don't, like, their assessment of your writing is not colored by like, oh, this guy is, no good, or this guy is so great, or whatever he writes is just gold. So interpretation of the writer. So when you think about what you're trying to do, think about this as a very social process. This is connecting with other people, basically.
it's not just about text generation. Text is secondary. Connections with people, relationships, interaction with the readers is primary. Shall we take a little break? Or you guys want to go through without the break?
I think we can keep going.
Keep going.
Then have the break at 7 o'clock.
Okay, yeah. All right, let's keep going. The Norwegians would have said break. My students would be like, no, we're done. Let's keep it. You guys agree.
But do you need a break?
No, I don't. I'm fine. I'm fine. I was just worried about overloading with all the stuff. I'm good. All right. Let's see. All right. So here's the thing, and this is the last thing before we do a little exercise. So maybe we'll take some time home. So one other thing that I want us to think about is how all our different academic disciplines think about writing in different ways, and how different disciplines structure their writing differently, and how writing in different disciplines look differently because different disciplines think differently. So if you're in engineering, for example, your academic writing in engineering will look very different from someone in medicine, from someone in management or business, from someone in humanities, from someone in philosophy. And that is because every discipline has its own way of thinking, processing knowledge. The fancy name for this, there was this British, I think it was British, John Swales, this linguist who came up with this concept that he called the discourse community. Of course, the word discourse just basically means the way to use language, right? So this theory says that basically people can be divided into different groups based on how they use language, essentially. And the article that he published on this first was about he was a stamp collector, and he's talking about his stamp collecting club and how they use language differently as stamp collectors from what they do like in everyday life, basically. So Swales says essentially that every academic discipline has its own research, it's its own discourse community. And as members of the discipline, we develop our own particular ways of using language, which is different from our neighbors in a different field. And so he says the first, there are the six characteristics of that. In order to become a discourse community, you have to kind of fulfill all the six features. And so the first one that a discourse community should have a shared public goal. And when I ask my students like what they think that means, they all say, well, the purpose of research is to advance knowledge, right? And that's correct. But we can go further and say, what is the public goal of my discipline? Be it education or music or neuroscience or whatever. What is my discipline trying to do? What kind of knowledge are we advancing? For what purpose? For whom? Even like, what does knowledge in my discipline look like? What makes knowledge in my discipline? That sounds like a really basic question, but like it's relevant because different academic fields think of knowledge differently. A very, very basic example, some disciplines love statistics, statistical analysis of all sorts, and some don't. Those who love statistics think that you have to have large sets of data, which you can analyze and reduce to some small thing through a statistical analysis, because knowledge to them means large numbers of something that you can generalize, right? You take a huge data set because you want to make conclusions about a large population or large geographical space or something. That's knowledge. If you take a small sample size to these people, they will say, no, this is too small. This is not good enough. It's not knowledge. Other fields like anthropology, for example, they like small. They don't do statistics. They like to tell stories about small things. One person, one town, one country, one community, one group of people. Statistics are irrelevant to them because according to that thinking, if you tell a story about something, you can get in depth into something. So deep knowledge matters to them more than broad knowledge, right? So if you think about your own academic discipline, what does knowledge look like in your field? Like like if you look at something and you would say, yeah, in my field, this is like solid knowledge. Like this is what counts as knowledge. So going beyond just saying our job is to advance knowledge, like let's think about what our discipline's version of knowledge actually is, right? And what are we doing? Then Swale says the second thing is common means of intercommunication among members. And that's an easy one because like if you think about how do we communicate as academic researchers with one another? Papers, yeah. Conferences, right? Academic books, academic websites, now you have all sorts of weird things like blogs. So you have to have a common way of talking to other people in your discourse community. If you don't have that, you know this. Mechanisms for providing feedback.
Peer review.
Peer review, very good. Yeah, so peer review is like for all its problems, like, and it's got problems, but it's the best we've come up with as a community to kind of provide feedback for one another. So peer review is, in journalism, they don't do that. It's writing, but they don't do peer review, as far as I know, because it's fast and you have to kind of get through stuff fast. There are certain fields, though, like there are journals now that I work with chemists sometimes, and they've showed me these journals which publish this really cutting edge research, like really sort of has to be out quickly or it becomes old. So they don't do peer review now for some of those things. The editor of the journal decides if it's publishable, and they publish it online only because it's faster. And they publish it in a separate section, which essentially says this is not peer reviewed, but it's important stuff. And it's a short, like usually a 2 or 3 page kind of thing. But peer review is still, the golden standard. Develop and own genres. Do we all know what the word genre means? What's a genre?
Yeah. A kind of literature.
Kind of something. Yeah, it could be literature or film or music or, kind of some kind of a text, right? So in our case, we talk about academic writing. What kinds of genres do we have across disciplines?
Well, in general, it can be maybe qualitative and post.
That's more like research methods, I think. But the genres are the kinds of texts that we produce as academics.
Essays,
Articles, essays, again, books, conference papers, whatever. Right? Those are the genres. So if you show somebody who is not an academic article, they'll be like, what the hell is this, right? Like, let's say somebody has never seen an academic article. They won't know what to do with it because they're not familiar with the genre. We know what to do with it because we've read hundreds of them and we've seen them and we're writing them ourselves. So we own them. We own these genres. Right? We've developed them over time. They haven't always been around. They've been developing over time. By the way, this is sort of unrelated, but it's a fun little story. You all know when the novel was developed as a genre, roughly. The novel, the big book we read. How old is that, do you think? How old is the genre of the novel?
The first time someone said,
Yeah, like,
this is a novel.
take a guess, yeah.
The Bible is a novel.
No.
Like that, like this.
Well, strictly speaking, it's not, but okay. I'm talking like fiction, like, stuff you read for like entertainment.
Cervantes.
Cervantes is one of the first people, yeah. Before that, people did not write novels because there was no like need for them really. And somehow, like, it's not like it happened overnight, but like over some period of time, people began producing these kinds of books, these genres, right? Dickens, like Charles Dickens, he published, like, his novels are like 1,000 pages, like really long, right? But when he was writing them, he was actually not publishing them as novels. He was publishing them as magazine articles. Why? It was like a TV series, except it was in a magazine. You had to like get an episode every week. Why? He could make more money that way. So I'm serious. Magazines are paying better than printing a novel. And so every week he would write 20 pages, send it to a magazine, they would pay him whatever. And also the other thing was that people back then could not afford to buy thick books, but they could afford to buy magazines. So that's how you reach your audience. So these runners, they develop over time because there is some need. The academic article, the research article, I'm not a historian of science, but I know kind of enough to be dangerous. The Royal Academy of Sciences in Great Britain was the first organization that actually concerned itself systematically with academic research and writing about academic research. So them and the French thinkers were kind of responsible for the academic article. Before that, it did not exist either. And that's only a couple of 100 years. So it's developed over time, and we own those things, right? Then the next one is Lexis. This is where we get to language. And it's funny because most people, like if we went on the street and say, well, what's academic writing? They're going to say, you have big words, you use big words and fancy grammar. No, you do, but that's not required. It's not the most important thing. But you do need some specialized words at some point to kind of be of this country club. And then finally, minimum level of expertise required for entry. In our case, it's our degree, right? You cannot get an academic job without a PhD, usually, or at least a master's degree. So in order to enter that profession, we need some read a piece of paper. Minimum level of expertise. The piece of paper proves to the people who evaluate us that we know what we're doing, essentially. So the moral of the story here is that, and this is probably something you know, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that you need to think about academic writing mostly how it relates to your discipline and to your academic field. Don't worry about what others do. I mean, you can know about it, like you can kind of understand what, if you have a friend who's in chemistry or physics or whatever, of course it's okay to know what they do. But when you think about academic writing, think about your disciplinary culture, your disciplinary conventions. IMRAD, the structure is part of that. There are fields that don't use IMRAD because that's not how they think. Okay? And then there are fields who do because they want the results to be replicated, for example. So you do your methods and your results so that other people can do the same. So that's like the last thing I think I wanted to give you. Any questions about this before we move on? Because the second half is coming up, but I wanted to kind of see if you have any questions about this. And then we'll do a little exercise. All right, cool. So find a neighbor. Let's do a little 10-minute thinking. I want you to describe your resource community or your academic field, basically. So I want you to run your academic discipline through these, like, see if you can describe these 6 things in relation to your own research field with a neighbor. And the online people, you can do it individually because you don't have a neighbor. So you can kind of think about it yourself, maybe, and we'll see what we can do. Think about your specific discipline, and you could dig sort of as deeply as you want. You could say, okay, I'm studying, educational policy, for example. You could say even like I'm studying this particular topic inside educational policy, or this particular subfields within the field. So what's the goal of that subfield? What's the goal of that little community within the field? What are we trying to do here? I mean, you could say to develop better policies, I guess that would be okay. But like, what's better policy? Like, how do you know that it's better? So you could dig this as deep as you want. So any ideas on the first one for your field? None? I'm sure you have something.
We were discussing this what you said. We were saying like what we have in common is that we want to improve education.
Okay.
One of us said, what's improving education?
Exactly. That's a great question.
So another goal would be to develop common knowledge about what is improving, what is
Right. Okay.
better, what is
Yeah.
in our proposal would be able to tackle.
Yeah. So you can imagine how, if you ask those kinds of questions, then you can imagine that if you take an article from the field, it would probably be trying to answer those kind of research questions, like how do we know that we improve? So you might imagine the design, the research study design, that measures something that will allow you to answer the question, right? Which will be very discipline specific. You would not see this in music. Well, maybe you will if it's music education. I don't know. You will not see this in sociology or in physics. And so that, and not this, not the words. We're very determined what a discipline-specific academic text looks like and does, right? So asking those kinds of questions rather than questions for me. Anything else on the first one? Any other disciplines?
What's the same?
Same, yeah. So that actually helps in practice also. Like if you, what's the system here? Like when you get to a PhD program, do they tell you what to research, or do you come up with your own projects?
On projects.
On projects, because in Norway they tell you what to research.
Really?
The PhD students, they are full-time employees. They pay them a salary. So when you apply to a PhD program, you're essentially applying for a job. And usually it's a lab or a research group that's funded through a grant. So they say, we're going to pay you this amount of money for 5 years or 6 years if you research something related to what our group is interested in researching.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of hand you a part of the project and say, this is your responsibility, go. I'm more used to what you guys are doing because I studied in the US, and that's what you do. You come up with your own project. So like, let's say you come into a program and you kind of wondering like, what shall I research? What's a good thing to study? Look at the public goals of your community all the way down to your lab, or to your group, or to your supervisor, and like think about what's important to the field, right? What the field concerns itself with. What are the questions that are being asked in the field, and what's interesting and what's important. And you can do that by thinking about sort of like, what's the purpose of my discipline, right? So that's practically even applicable. Okay, cool. Any means of intercommunication that may be different from different field to field, like how we talk to one another? Does anyone have any like unusual maybe way of interacting within your field that other fields don't use?
We were discussing also, Vanessa shared what her thesis was about, and she said, and someone said, but is that for improving? Is that for improving education?
Right. Yeah.
And she said, no, I'm from the theory
Right. Okay.
section. I don't know how to say it. But
Yeah. No, that's okay.
we had like a different, we couldn't communicate.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a great example. So for example, let's say you can both say, let's imagine we can both say, we both study education, right? But let's say you study the practical side, where your goal is to like, how do we make better lesson plans? I mean, whatever. This is an example. And her goal is to like, what educational theories are best for this or that, right? And so then your articles that you write will look very different from one another. Because in your case, it might certainly be something like experimental design of some sort, maybe interviews with students, surveys, teachers, I don't know. In our case, it might be something more like a philosophical almost, like here's one theory, here's another theory, because our goal is not the same as yours, right? You're advancing different goals, even though technically you're in the same field, the different subfields. Like in my field, like there are people who are concerned with like rhetoric, like the history of rhetoric, like people who are studying like the Greeks and the Romans still. And then there are people who study like workplace communication, like now. And they're in the same field, but they have very different goals. In the first case, it's more like I guess, traditional humanities in a way, like let's understand what people did 2,000 years ago, which is great. And the other one is like, let's improve workplace practices and people communicate more efficiently. So technically they're in the same field, but they're doing very different research because their goals are different. And then communication is also interesting because, like, have you ever seen an engineer's CV or a computer scientist's CV?
No.
They usually have like hundreds of publications. You go like, how did you manage to write so much in your 10, 15, 20-year career? It's impossible. And then you realize that their articles are 2 pages long. Oh, okay, now I get it. And that's because their knowledge is very, like, it's a small, like, it's very, what's the word? Like, they don't ask big questions. They're like, here's how we can improve this cybersecurity technique, for example. Quick 2-page, 3-page solution, problem solution, publish quickly. And so they write hundreds of these. Like, I'm sure there are some people in that field that sort of do more theoretical stuff as well, but very often you see these quick write-ups that become published, and you kind of have to wonder, like, how did you manage to write so much? That's not really that much. But that's because their discipline wants that kind of a thing. That kind of knowledge, that kind of a text is valued. Right? I guess feedback would be the same for all of us, more or less, right? Peer review, we kind of decided.
But also, I think in education, some colleagues said that the product of the research are didactics materials.
Yeah.
The feedback of this kind of production could be the peer review between academics, but also with teachers that are in the schools and high school.
Good point. So yeah, you could write for other academics, but you could also write something that's digestible by the teachers. And an average school teacher doesn't have time to read, 25-page articles. So they would need something kind of practical, right? Something they can use. So then you have to think about, how do I adjust what I write to that audience? How do I present my research in such a way that can be usable by teachers, that can be easily applied in a busy classroom, right? Any genres that are sort of maybe different between the fields, or do we all just do articles?
Well, didactic material might
yeah.
be also another genre.
Yeah, so if you're developing like classroom materials, right?
Yes,
Based on research.
based on research and ethical guidelines
Right, okay.
or problematic
Yeah.
questions.
So let's say you published an article or a book chapter that describes a method of teaching something in the secondary school.
Mhm.
That's a good example. Whereas, somebody from a different field comes in and says, this doesn't look like research the way I know it in my field, but to you, it's research-based, certainly research. So again, you have a different things for what counts as research even, because of the different disciplines. And again, computer scientists like conference papers more than they like articles, because articles take a long time to get out, and conference papers can be done quickly.
Conference paper?
Yeah.
Something to be read on a conference?
Well, rather talked about, whatever. But they like these conference papers because they can be presented quite quickly. They don't require extensive peer review, because the nature of knowledge in their discipline, at least that's what they say, things change so quickly that you cannot wait 6 to 9 months to kind of put something out, because it'll be old by then. So they like to get stuff out quickly because of that. Specialized lexis. Anybody uses any fancy words?
Lexis meaning
Vocabulary,
vocabulary.
words, yeah.
Lexicon.
So like, is there like a word that you feel really loves?
Competencia.
We all have,
Well,
right?
If you are working with a theoretic
Yeah.
under a certain, then you do have
You have to use certain
words
words.
and
Right? Yeah. A little digression. Have you guys heard about how to determine whether ChatGPT wrote something? If you see a lot of the use of the word delve in or unravel, that's ChatGPT.
Really?
But for some reason it likes those words. I don't know why, but I guess it got trained to use them.
Unravel?
Unravel or delve into.
Delve into.
Delve, yeah. So if you tell it to write an academic paper and then you read it, you will almost be guaranteed to see those words in there. So it's almost like a joke at this point, but like, yeah. This is definitely so like we all have these like words that we like, right? Like that our discipline thinks are like good words to use. By the way, again, going back to my own anecdotes, when I started my master's program in the US again, my English was fine, but I had never written like an academic paper at the master's level in English, so like, I had no idea. And then I'm taking this class, and this guy, the professor said, "Well, write a paper," and like he didn't process. He said, "Write a paper, bring it back in a week." So I was like, "What do I do?" So I like remember like literally looking at my lecture notes from his lectures and like imitating the things that he said because that sounded like smart. So I used like the words that he had used, the expressions that he had used in his lectures to put together something. Gotta be, it worked. But I was like, yeah, I'm just gonna like monkey things here. I'm like, I don't understand. I mean, I understand it, but it's like, I don't know why, but these are the things that he used. Therefore, they must be good. Imitation. And then level of expertise, I think that's pretty clear for all of us. It's mostly PhD, right? There are some fields that do something called Master of Fine Arts, MFA, which is the highest level. Like if you were teaching like fiction writing, for example, your highest degree would not be a PhD. It would be Master of Fine Arts, MFA. So that's also different. In music, I think there is musicology, right? And then there is performance.
What is it relevant?
So like let's say you teach people how to write fiction. Let's say you have a creative writing class, like people who want to learn how to write novels and short stories. Typically, if you're doing that, your degree would not be a PhD. Your degree would be a Master of Fine Arts.
Oh, okay.
Which is the highest degree in that field that you can get.
Yeah.
There is no PhD in fine arts, in creative writing. Master of Fine Arts is like,
Yeah.
Right? So there's that. Like, I think there are some practical applications to this. I mean, some of it sort of looks very abstract, but there's also some practical applications, like I said in the beginning. If you're kind of wondering what a good research question is for your project, like what should I research? Look at the shared public goals and kind of think, what does my field want to know? What does my field want to study? What does my field consider important? And then go from there. So let's leave this alone, and we have about half an hour, so I'm gonna give you another theoretical idea, and then we'll talk about that. We've done this. All right. So let's talk a little bit about structures of academic texts. We don't have time to like get into the full like IMRAC thing. And we'll do a second session later on this week. But for now, what I wanted to bring up is this idea, something called rhetorical moves. You all know what rhetoric means, right? The word rhetoric. What do you think it means? Rhetoric. It doesn't mean what the news channels on TV tell us it means, by the way.
Rhetoric.
Yeah.
How do you write it?
Right. So like
Retórica.
so like ancient Greeks came up with this. We look at Aristotle, who lived 2,500 years ago, who said rhetoric is the study of available means of persuasion. It's basically how do you use language in such a way that persuades others, that's effective. So we take the word rhetoric to understand like how do you use language in ways that influences other people in some way, persuades them, makes them believe what you're saying. The media now uses rhetoric to mean lies, right? Oh, it's just empty rhetoric. Politicians use rhetoric because they lie. No, that's not rhetoric, that's lies. Or propaganda, whatever. Rhetoric actually means, again, effective use of language for a particular purpose. That's what it is. And so in academic writing, rhetoric usually consists of things like how do we present our results, for example, of our research in a way that's convincing to other people, in a way that people will look at it and say, yeah, I get this. This is good stuff. I can believe this. This is convincing to me, right? So that's sort of how rhetoric applies in this case. So I wanted to bring up the notion of rhetorical moves and then illustrate that through writing an introduction section for your article, which if you're writing IMRAD, Introduction, Methods, Research, and Discussion, you will need to write an introduction. I mean, you will always need to write one, they just will know it. So the concept of a rhetorical move is basically like an instance of using language with a particular purpose. If you're writing a letter to your grandmother, and if you want her to do something for you, and you say, I really need you to do this for me because of this, this, and this, that's a rhetorical move. If you're writing an email to your supervisor, and you say, I'm finished with the first draft, can we set up a meeting to discuss? That's a rhetorical move. You're trying to achieve a goal through it. If you're writing a memo at work to your boss and you say, you know, we're working on this project, I need more people to do this because it's huge, that's a rhetorical move. You're asking for something. You're trying to get something done. In academic writing, when you do things like cite previous research, for example, because we all depend on previous research, right? We don't just come out and start with our own stuff. We have to begin with reviewing previous research. Introduction. So reviewing previous research, talking about what people before you did on this topic is a rhetorical move, right? So when somebody says to you, why do you need the introduction? You could say, well, it's because everyone does it, okay? Or you could say it's because in order to set up my own project, my own question, my own research, my own results, I need to connect that to previous knowledge. That's a rhetorical move. So let's look at how this works in the introduction a little bit. So for example, we'll talk about cars in a minute. What I want to focus on now is what the introductions do. Yeah. Of course, they review existing literature, but why? What's the move here? They define and narrow arguments. They, you know, in order to be able to define a question or an argument, you kind of have to look at what came before. To sort of like, what do people talk about? Like, what's important? What's interesting? What does my field consider to be, you know, a necessary topic or a question? Like, there are some things that are, you don't have to argue. Everybody kind of agrees already on that, right? In every one of our fields, there are some questions that, like, we don't need to say much about it because everyone agrees. Yeah, that's been answered, right? But then there are some questions that are like really new. People are arguing about them. And so in order to set that up, you need to kind of say what people before you have said about it. Make sense?
Yeah.
So that's a rhetorical move in introductions. It looks a little different from field to field. For example, if you look at a paper from, there's a really nice book actually, which I would recommend called Academic Writing for Graduate Students. Don't tell this to anyone, but there is a free PDF floating on the internet. If you Google it, you don't have to even pay for it, but if you want to buy it, it's a really great book and it's not that expensive. So they give examples of different articles from different disciplines. And there's one there that I really like from art history, where it does not follow IMRAD. It does not have a section that's called an introduction. It does not have a section that's called methods. But yet, when you read it, you realize that the rhetorical moves are the same. They talk about a painter, and they're setting up in the first page, they're setting up like, why do we need to talk about this painter? Why is this important? Right? That's a rhetorical move. It's the same exact move as you would see in a chemistry article about some chemistry problem, where they use the introduction to set up the problem. So that's what you see in introductions. That's the move. Another example in the book is from engineering. And the article talks about how when you have cold weather, really cold weather, bridges apparently, because you put salt on them to melt the ice, they deteriorate, the bridges collapse. Concrete does not do well with ice. And so these engineers are saying, what can we do to prevent the bridges from doing that? And they say we need a different method of inspecting the bridges to understand what the concrete actually looks like inside. That's a very engineering approach because it's problem solution. And if you look at the introduction of that article, it basically just says, here's the problem based on previous research. Here's why we need to inspect these bridges differently because they keep falling down. But they use previous research to show why that's important. So the move is again the same. It looks a little different, but it's the same move. So then, you know, if you, by the time you get down to the end of this, you will be able to narrow down the large topic to a question, basically, to your research question. And by the way, posing a research question is also a rhetorical move, because if you don't have a research question, then it's not really research. It's a description of something, maybe it's like a report, maybe. But in order for it to research, you need to have a question, and that's a rhetorical thing. And then finally, this is really important: knowledge gaps. Have you heard the expression knowledge gap? Yeah, that's 100% rhetorical move in every research article, every discipline. You need to show that there is some space which has not yet been filled by someone, and say, we know this, we don't know that, we're going to fill that, gap, right? Knowledge gap. And if you want to talk about language, like everyone's favorite word is however. See it a lot, right? And it usually shows up at the end of an introduction, because you'll say, we know this, we know this, we know this, we know this, however, we don't know this, knowledge gap. So let's fill in the knowledge gap. So again, the language even is not random. It's the language serves the rhetorical moves to fulfill it, right? And then last thing before we talk, the CARS, this thing here, stands for creating a research space. And basically, it's in that book that I just recommended to you, the Writing for Graduate Students. Basically, it's a way to organize your introduction around these rhetorical moves of reviewing previous knowledge, identifying the gap, identifying the question first, and then identifying the gap. Or the other way, gap first, question second. So the CARS model claims that to write an introduction pretty much in any discipline, you need to do three things. Tell your readers what's been done before, tell them what the gap is, and tell them what your question is. So when we're sitting down to our next article and we're wondering where do we begin, how do we begin, go back to the beginning of today's session when you're taking your notes. Those are the kinds of things you can think about. What do we know? What's the gap? What's the question? Right? Questions? Again, usually we spend about 6 hours on this with my students, and that's but they don't have 6 hours. So this is usually one class session with just 6 hours in my case. So anything else? Any comments? Does any of this look different in your field? Maybe I'm simplifying things. Maybe you don't know this doesn't work this way, or does it?
I like it because I think I'm doing field notes, and
Yeah.
it made me feel what you said. It's like there's stuff I'm doing that at some point I felt it was messy, and I was like a little bit overwhelmed. But then it was like, oh, okay, yeah.
Are you doing like an anthropological study of some sort? Or?
Yeah, well, you can say so. We're working with adolescents,
Oh yeah.
young people,
Right.
and we are trying to co-create with them to build a pedagogy.
Pedagogy.
I like it.
You know what's funny?
And also to the ethical issues of
Right.
trying to really create an horizontal
I had
institutional order.
I had 2 PhD students in my academic writing class last semester who were doing something very similar in Oslo. They were talking to young people, co-creating educational programs with them. So that tells me that this is something that your field considers very important, right?
Yeah.
Across countries, in many places, seems to be the thing.
Mhm.
So when you take your field notes, then like you're thinking like, how do I get a question out of it, or like what's the challenge there?
It's just that when I'm doing field notes, I'm trying to write everything that happened.
Yeah.
In every level. And also already kind of analyzing.
Yeah,
I cannot help it because it's very
of
hard
course. Yeah.
to have them first accept me by treating them not like disciplinary and really trying to hold space for them. And also really trying to listen to their ideas, especially when they do not want to give their ideas, and the power struggles in the classroom and everything. It's just a lot.
Yeah.
So my I've been writing a lot.
Yeah.
Well, as you said.
Yeah, yeah. So the other thing about your situation, I think that's interesting, is that anthropology, like anthropological methods, typically rely on storytelling, right?
Yeah.
And so you will not always find a specific question in anthropology which says like, here's my research question. But it's like, let's tell some stories and hear some stories and then we'll make sense of them somehow.
Yeah.
So that's a very different kind of,
Yeah. Because
And the style of writing also was our we share kind of the same approach, and our analysis is post-qualitative analysis. So we are plugging in the theory and the data.
yeah,
So it's
yeah,
like a rhythmatic
right,
journey. So
Yeah.
it's going back and forward, and,
Yeah.
and the way is just to spend time on
Yeah.
writing.
Yeah.
Because if
Yeah.
you keep reading or keep
It makes
making
sense.
notes at the
Yeah.
end, we are not gonna get to the time that we are ready to write.
right,
It's
Yeah.
the way you spread.
yeah. So another student I had last semester was an trained anthropologist who was hired. Well, like I said, when you apply to a PhD program in Norway, you get hired basically to participate in a big project of some sort. And he worked with this group that was studying, I think it was something about motivation in the workplace or whatever, very social science kind of thing. And so social science research methods, of course, are usually qualitative, and you kind of go and talk to people and do interviews. And then you code, right? You make themes, and you talk about themes.
Yeah.
But this guy's an anthropologist, so he was interested in storytelling. So he went and collected all these stories and talked to people and observed them. And then when he began writing the article, he's kind of like, well, on the one hand, I really want to tell stories. But on the other hand, my boss wants me to be social sciencey and answer a question. And so he produced this really interesting draft, which was trying kind of to do both. And it didn't work very well. It's kind of like a two-headed dragon, it's like, are you doing this or are you doing this? It's a very different thing. So we had to have a conversation. We do peer review a lot in the class, so we all had to kind of talk about how do you reconcile those two ways of thinking. These are ways of thinking, basically. One is question-driven, one is story-driven. You can't really do both. You kind of have to choose. So I think he ended up going with his stories, and I don't know if he's published the article yet, but these are the things that are really interesting. That's what I said in the beginning. It's not about language. You could do this in Swahili. I mean, it doesn't matter what the language is. It doesn't. These kinds of things, we need to understand them regardless of what language we use. When I got to Norway 6 years ago, I was teaching undergraduate engineering students, and I noticed that they all love to write this sort of, on the one hand this, on the other hand that, when the assignment wasn't asking for that at all. And I talked to my colleagues, said, what's up with this? Everybody's doing on the one hand, on the other hand. They're like, oh, yeah, that. In high school, they have this huge assignment at the end where they're supposed to analyze an issue. So they're conditioned, they're kind of enculturated into this way of thinking. So it's like you learn the genre and you kind of sort of just think, this is academic writing, right? On the one hand, I'm like, no, we're not doing it here. So it's funny, we get used to something, then it's like you need to change, but it's hard to change. I don't know why I'm telling this. But it's not about the language, I guess is what I'm telling you. You could use this in any language. So is there anything, if you talk about introductions in your discipline, what do they look like? How long are they? The basic question, in your field, how long is an introduction section?
How long?
Yeah, how much time do you spend, how much space do you spend setting up your own studies?
You mean the introduction in general, not just the writing?
The place where you're doing this, this, and this.
In an article.
Yeah, how many pages?
Pages.
Yeah, how long? 2 or 3, okay. What's your discipline?
Philosophy.
Philosophy, okay, yeah. Okay, philosophy education. Anybody else?
Yeah, in my case, it's there's depends on how big the words the words are, but
How long the words are?
not so long. That's what I want.
Not too long, not too, yeah. Does anyone have really long introductions, 10 pages, 8 pages, 7 pages? No. All right. Well, some fields do, and I think it's interesting also to look at like how the sources, like the other research that you're using, how do you cite them in your text and how do you integrate them into your text? I don't have any examples right now, but if you look at an engineering article, any of them, what you would see very often is you would see like someone makes a claim, makes a statement, and then they have this number system, right? Where sources are numbered. You seen those?
Yeah.
And you have like statement and then like 5 numbers in one sentence. Because like if there are 5 sources that support that claim, and I'm going to put them all in there. And so in the end, you end up with an introduction that's maybe 1 page, but has like 35 sources. And that's what they do. That's a disciplinary convention in engineering. On the other hand, if you look at a philosophy article, you talk about your sources, you explain them. You don't just make a statement and have numbers. You say, according to so-and-so, blah, 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 a paragraph is gone. According to so-and-so, blah, 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 another half page is gone. You kind of sort of converse about them. You explain everything. You say, this person says this, the other person says that, another page is gone. So it's like, it's so like tied to the field and to the question that you're trying to answer. Because in general, in the humanities, we like to kind of explain things, right? Whereas in technical fields, engineering, hard sciences, statement, source, look it up for yourself. I'm not going to tell you. So yeah. Any other questions? We have about 10 minutes left. What else can I tell you?
I have one question
Yeah.
about the writing process.
Yeah.
That was
You want to go back to that? Let's see if we can go back to it so without messing it up. There we go.
because last year I was doing a lot of reading and no
Yeah.
writing,
Uh-huh.
and this year I'm trying to
Yeah.
both
Yeah.
reading and writing. And the problem I'm finding now is I don't know when to stop. When is
When to
the
stop
job
reading?
like that? What?
When to stop reading?
I'm
Right.
writing.
Right.
Like when do I stop incorporating? Like yes. Is it like till here? Because I decide so, or do you at some point say,
Yeah.
oh, it's that?
Ah.
Having you decide on that.
It's a judgment call. You kind of have to just look at what you have and say, is this adequate to answer my question? Right. So you have to make a judgment. You have to decide, is this enough to kind of make sense? Because you cannot include everything, obviously, because there's too much. But you also have to have enough to kind of like for people to look at it and say, yeah, that sort of covers the basis. And as you become, I think as you do more of this, you will kind of learn to understand what's needed, like how much, like if you're talking like, let's say you're reviewing some theories, right? Like, well, did you cover the basics of all the theories? Did you cover like everything that your readers would need to know to understand them? I don't know how many sources that might take, maybe 1, maybe 5, maybe 10, I don't know. But that's the kind of thinking that I think is needed to kind of say I'm done. There was a kind of a snarky, somebody asked, so how many sources do I need to have? And the other person said, all of them. That's not, that's a joke, obviously. You cannot have all of them because there are like millions. But yeah, it's a judgment call. I don't know. I think you have to kind of look at what you've written and say, this does the job. It's the best I can tell you. What else? Like a lot of this is just really kind of like saying to yourself, I'm going to do it this way. It's a mindset. It's like getting into the habit of doing it this way rather than whatever other way you may have been used to before. Yeah.
And you talk about the pre-writing, like
Pre-writing,
where you write everything kind of.
Right.
Did you structure everything a bit? Because
Yeah.
then I'm thinking about the this structure of interaction methods.
It's individual. To an extent, there are many different things you can do. Like I said, some people like to write lists. So like, let's say you have a list of ideas. You just kind of sit down and say, let me write them all down as a list. Yeah. I like to begin writing in paragraph form right away. So that's my pre-writing, where I say to myself, maybe I have no idea what it's going to look like in 3 months. I really don't. But I'm going to start sort of writing some stuff down that right now I think would be important from 3 months from now. I was just writing an article, I think last year, which was kind of not really my area of expertise immediately, so I had to learn a lot. So I began by just basically writing down what I thought I knew. Half of it turned out not to be true. As I began learning more, I realized that what I had written before was junk. So I started again. So I like to write paragraphs, but again, lists, brainstorming, like you just kind of like get it all out. Just that's the thing, like you need to get it all out. Let's have something in front of you, not in here, but on the computer screen or a piece of paper.
And how did you manage a version of documents? Are you
Google Docs.
linear? Are you-
I like Google Docs because I can see what came before.
Okay.
Obviously, you can also, if your school uses OneDrive, Microsoft. I don't know if you guys do or not. But in OneDrive, you can also look at versions that came before. I don't like attachments. Like sending attachments, kind of you get confused by them, you get lost by them. Yeah, but I like Google Docs a lot. Okay. Well, thank you guys very much. This was, I mean, again, this was very compressed and very quick, but I hope it's useful in some way. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por la sesión que nos has dado. Creo que no solo nos ha sido muy interesante, sino que además nos ha abierto un poco el estómago para seguir indagando con ese libro que nos has recomendado y con profundizar un poco en todas estas lecturas que ya nos abrieron la sesión anterior, porque estuvimos también con la profesora Marcela Carpa, y hoy hemos continuado un poco más. Y nada, con esto le damos las gracias, cerramos la sesión y tomamos un descansito de 10 minutitos, porque a continuación el doctor Caleya nos va a presentar con mucha ilusión los avances de su tesis, que está muy al principio del proceso, pero tiene una tesis muy interesante y creo que con lo que estamos aquí, que tenemos eso, distintas perspectivas desde la filosofía, desde personas que ya están más al final del proceso y otros que a lo mejor usan más participativa, igual podemos aportar y ayudarlo con su tesis. Así que con esto nos vemos a las 7:10. ¿Os parece bien? Y continuamos.
Vale, bueno, pues ya estamos de vuelta, aunque haya personas que se hayan fugado de forma vil, no. Ya estamos de vuelta después del descanso. Esta vez, como el taller de Pavel duraba un poquito más, al final solo tenemos una ponencia de grandioso y bien acogido Víctor Caleya. Víctor Caleya comenzó como investigador en el... Vale. Bueno, en esta ponencia nuestro compañero nos presentará los avances de su estudio que analiza cómo se puede evaluar la creatividad en entornos universitarios y qué estrategias pueden potenciarla. Además, explora la relación entre la creatividad y el compromiso en el aprendizaje. Víctor Caleya comenzó como investigador en el ELBUL 1846, que ya nos contará qué es, colaborando con Ferran Adrià en proyectos relacionados con la creatividad y la innovación. Desde entonces ha continuado contribuyendo al entendimiento de la creatividad y la innovación como profesor participante en el programa Extra por Educar entre 2021 y 2023 y como docente en la Universidad Pontificia de Comilla, en el IED Cutzland Bilbao en el 23 y la Universidad CEU Gasma desde 2022. Además ha participado en congresos como Gastroinnova en Canarias y por Management Innovation en Santander. En cuanto a su formación académica, es graduado en Filosofía, Política y Economía por la Universidad de Pompeu Fabra. Tiene un máster en Filosofía por la Universidad de Soborna y un máster en Educación por la UNED. Bienvenido, Víctor. La verdad que estamos muy ilusionados porque hemos oteado un poco ya tu temática de tesis y estamos todos como con mucha curiosidad de a ver hacia dónde te diriges. Así que nada, todo tuyo y nos vemos luego en la ronda de preguntas.
Muchas gracias. A ver, lo primero de todo, por aclarar, parece ahí un experto de lo que sea, todavía no sé definir qué es creatividad, ¿vale? Entonces vamos a... es como... soy Víctor, efectivamente de una suerte que como la palabra creatividad e innovación son las palabras sexys a día de hoy, me van llamando para charlas, clases y demás. Y por otro lado, tengo la suerte de estar en el programa Empieza por Educar, no sé si alguien aquí lo conoce. Entonces he estado dando clases en FP Básica, ahí en Villaverde Bajo, y he podido enfrentarme, pues por un lado, la parte de teoría, de creatividad a nivel de investigación privada, y a su vez lo iba poniendo en práctica con estas pequeñas actividades, como hablaba ahora con Guillermo, para ver hasta qué punto tenían acogida o no con los chavales de Villaverde. No sé si se me escucha bien, por ahí, ¿vale? Vale. Entonces, nada, os cuento los avances en la tesis doctoral. Empecé en octubre, así que llevo poco. Lo que sí que pasa es que traía algunas intuiciones de casa que al final ha derivado en vamos a ver si esto es verdad o no y vamos a probarlo a través de una investigación. Para la presentación, ahí no se me pasa, ¿eh? Pero bueno, en cualquier caso, me he preparado una pequeña presentación así para ir tocando los puntos, porque se me va a olvidar si no, de preguntas de investigación, objetivos y demás. Pero he venido aquí a que me metéis caña, soy el novato, entonces por favor, ser duros.
¿Prueba? A ver.
Ahí está, fenomenal. Ser duros, ser críticos, lo que sea, estamos para eso, ¿vale? Empiezo rápidamente. Yo vengo del campo de la filosofía, me obsesioné bastante con un concepto marxista, que es el concepto de alienación, que era por qué hay seres, individuos que sufren una serie de bloqueos y no pueden realizarse, desarrollarse por unas limitaciones sociales. Y tras haberme metido en ese marrón, busqué esta parte más positiva, que es, oye, ¿cómo podemos conseguir que cada ser humano, y en este sentido los estudiantes, puedan desarrollarse, puedan realizarse? Entonces, de nuevo, a nivel de intuición, me parecía que la creatividad juega y debe jugar un papel fundamental en esta parte de, vamos a llamarlo, realización, florecimiento, como os guste la palabra, y me he aventurado a esta tesis doctoral. Entonces, lo primero de todo, la idea de la tesis es, vamos a diseñar un instrumento, lo primero de todo, que nos permita medir la creatividad. Ya eso es un temón, pero no solo eso, sino que la gracia es hacer una intervención educativa, un programa fundamentado en ejercicios validados científicamente que promuevan el desarrollo de la creatividad y ver hasta qué punto este instrumento de medición sensibiliza con esos cambios o los puede coger o no, ¿vale? Si en algún momento no entendéis algo de más, por favor, me interrumpís y me canso muchísimo de escucharme. Sí, por favor, me paráis. ¿Qué pasa? Ya con el director de tesis me hizo la primera intervención y me dijo, claro, amigo, tú estás diciendo que vas a hacer un instrumento de medición del pensamiento creativo, vas a hacer un programa para desarrollar el pensamiento creativo y vas a demostrar que funciona. Pero ¿hasta qué punto eso va a contribuir, vinculándolo con la charla anterior, a un objetivo para mejorar la educación de calidad? Ahí en el fondo era una creencia mía y con toda la razón del mundo me dio un poco en la frente y he caído en que lo que quiero vincular es que la creatividad, además de que creo que en lo personal tiene un valor en sí, a nivel educativo puede tener un valor académico. Y esto es cómo el fomento del pensamiento creativo, de la creatividad, esto es un libro de llamarlo pensamiento creativo, creatividad, como queráis. El caso es cómo puede mejorar la implicación en el proceso creativo de los estudiantes. Dicho con nuestras palabras, hasta qué punto, si tú estás dando la oportunidad a los estudiantes de ser creativos, vamos a conseguir que se enganchen más en su proceso de aprendizaje, es decir, tiene bastante que ver con motivación, pero también en el nivel de intensidad y de calidad que están trabajando los contenidos, ¿vale? A nivel de proceso cognitivo. A nivel del contexto que nos encontramos, creo que nos encontramos, por un lado, con unos estudiantes que cada vez están pidiendo un mayor nivel de estímulos, esta sobreestimulación que tanto se habla, y tenemos respuestas como la gamificación. Y para mí, creo que parte de no sé cómo decirlo, que la creatividad tiene que jugar un componente fundamental en esto, ya no para hacer que las clases sean divertidas de juegos, sino para darles la oportunidad a los estudiantes de ejercer la actividad, es decir, de ser sujetos activos. ¿Vale? No sé si me explico bien. Entonces, en vez de ser sujetos pasivos que están recibiendo, ya no como el último youtuber comenta cómo juegan otros, que sea el estudiante, el alumno, la alumna que juegue con esos contenidos. A nivel específico, creo que estamos en un contexto que todo el mundo habla de innovación educativa, creatividad, pero yo sigo sin entender de manera clara un marco específico que nos ayude a entender qué es, qué no es, y a su vez, menos aún, una serie de instrumentos o de técnicas que los docentes podamos emplear en nuestras clases para tener cierta confianza que estamos consiguiendo unos estudiantes que muestren mayores niveles de creatividad. Entonces, como veis, son grandes temas, no sé hasta qué punto podré contribuir en un pelito o en un pelo más grande, pero bueno, en el fondo me estoy enfrentando a este asunto. Y la pregunta de investigación sería diseñar e implementar una intervención educativa efectiva que promueva el desarrollo del pensamiento creativo. Pensamiento creativo en estudiantes universitarios. Bueno, que si mejoramos la creatividad, vamos a mejorar el nivel de compromiso académico, de implicación en su proceso de aprendizaje, ¿sí o no? ¿O cómo? Para esto salen hipótesis, pero insisto que cada semana voy cambiando de cuál es verdaderamente la hipótesis principal. Por un lado, hay que ver la hipótesis de ¿podemos diseñar un instrumento de medición del pensamiento creativo con ya no solo una validación de propiedades psicométricas, sino que contemple su creatividad de manera amplia y vasta? Porque muchas veces cuando hacemos, no sé hasta qué punto estáis familiarizados, cuando se hacen los test, suele ser test de a ver cuántas caras o cuántas imágenes se te ocurren en un círculo. Pero sigue siendo medir una parte muy concreta de un aspecto creativo y no la creatividad en sus distintas facetas. Entonces, primera hipótesis, podemos encontrar este instrumento. Segunda hipótesis, en el caso de que lo encontremos y realizamos este programa, ¿habrá diferencia entre los que han hecho el programa y los que no? Ya, pequeño spoiler, se buscará un grupo de control. Y luego, tercera hipótesis, los estudiantes que han hecho este programa no solo mejoran en creatividad, pensamiento creativo, sino que en este nivel de activación que estamos fomentando y favoreciendo, va a haber también una correlación positiva con esta idea de la implicación que tienen en su proceso de aprendizaje. ¿Hasta aquí bien? ¿Qué tal vamos de tiempo?
Bien.
A nivel metodológico, se tendrá grupo experimental, grupo de control. Uno de los pequeños retos y problemas es que el grupo no será aleatorio. También parto de la Universidad Francisco Vitoria se ha mostrado interesada en hacer esta investigación con sus estudiantes, entonces fenomenal y un regalo que os ha caído, que ya tenemos estas muestras. Una cosa negativa es que también me tengo que ir adaptando y van a hacer grupos de clase enteros que lo harán, grupos que no, pero no se podrá randomizar o aleatorizar la muestra. En cuanto... a ver, vale, entonces, a nivel metodológico, estoy un poco repitiendo todo el rato lo mismo, pero vamos, instrumento de medición por un lado, programa de intervención educativa por otro. A nivel de la muestra, serán estudiantes universitarios de primero de carrera, que sean universitarios, pues también porque me ha tocado y voy a aprovechar esto. Y dentro de eso, sí que me gustaría que fueran recién llegados a la universidad para ver también el recorrido de eso bachillerato y ver cómo este programa educativo puede favorecer a que cuando salgan de la carrera, o al menos del primer curso, muestren mayores niveles de pensamiento creativo. ¿Vale? Tamaño mínimo, pues ha sido un poco un triple que me he tirado, pero 200 estudiantes parecía bien a todo el mundo. Yo sigo diciendo 200 estudiantes. Y a nivel de criterios de inclusión y exclusión, sí que he pensado que como la palabra creatividad, los programas, talleres están tan de moda, si hay gente que ya ha realizado este tipo de intervenciones, habría que excluirla porque te puede sesgar la muestra. Un poco también, bueno, este es un triple a medias, este es un triple con un buen pase. Que la duración de la intervención, para que sea factible y que la universidad me diga, puedes hacerlo, son 4 semanas, el tiempo máximo que me permiten. Y a la vez me siento también bastante afortunado porque cuando me he estado metiendo en mundo académico, ver las intervenciones, eran intervenciones de una sesión de media hora, 2 sesiones de 1 hora lo sumo. Entonces digo, joder, pues dentro que cabe, fenomenal. Tiene cabida la posibilidad de hacer algo. A mí se me queda muy corto, y esto es uno de los límites, pero bueno, más de lo que ya hay. A todo esto, ¿qué se va a hacer en ese programa o qué intuyo que se puede hacer? Cosas que ya conocemos, es decir, temas de aprendizaje basado en proyectos, temas de aprendizaje experiencial o más un aprendizaje abierto, donde prime la reflexión y no respuestas de verdadero o falso. Y, a ver, no, y esta parte yo creo que la tendríamos, la parte de la intervención. Por último, yo creo que lo he ido diciendo un poco, pero la idea es, en el punto donde estamos, hay que hacer este pretest con este instrumento que muestre esa validación, después esa intervención y después el post-test para ver hasta qué punto ha habido una evolución o algún tipo de cambio. Resultados esperados, que este instrumento de edición tenga una validez y, por otro lado, pues que se cumplan los objetivos, es decir, que se demuestre que puede haber este aumento en la creatividad y no solo eso, sino que también veamos la correlación positiva con distintas variables, como es cuando hablo de implicación del aprendizaje es el learning engagement, ¿vale? El student engagement está ahí un poquillo en disputa entre estos dos términos. Y no solo eso, sino que como la Francisco Vitoria mide una cantidad de cosas, de competencias, pues vamos a aprovechar también para medir la correlación de una cantidad de cosas de nivel de autonomía, metacognición, autoconocimiento. Entonces, al final va a ser un poco, vamos probando, vamos viendo y si vemos algo que sea relevante, pues ahondaremos un poco más en esto. Sí, perdón.
En la anterior,
sí,
que la herramienta que vas a usar es una herramienta que está validada.
Sí, vale. Bueno, sí.
Bien, entonces, ¿cómo vas a demostrar que o sea, si funciona, vas a decir que la herramienta es validada, pero ya está validada?
Claro, aquí va a haber un mix. Por un lado, ¿qué es lo que sucede con la creatividad? Que hay muchas herramientas validadas, pero a la vez se utilizan de forma separada. Entonces, os pongo un ejemplo. Si yo ahora mismo cojo un test que es el Alternative Uses Test, te dan una botella y en 3 minutos tienes que decir todos los usos alternativos que se te ocurra para eso.
Y eso es un instrumento que está validado para medir la...
Es un instrumento que está validado. Entonces, ese, ya que tiene una validación y gran nivel de popularidad, se cogerá, pero no solo eso. Este es el punto, porque la creatividad se está midiendo así, que es como, vale, el nivel, la cantidad de respuestas que eres, el número de respuestas que eres capaz de dar al uso de las botellas determina tu creatividad. Pues ya que la intuición la creatividad es mucho más allá de esto, vamos a ir combinando distintos puntos para hacer un poco lo que podamos, pero sí que es desde cosas que ya han sido validadas.
Digamos que tu herramienta es una fusión de herramientas.
Sí, sí. En cierto modo está bien.
Paula Soto quiere preguntar algo. ¿Puedes poner el micro, Paula?
Sí, hola, ¿me escuchan? Sí, gracias. Mira, ¿sabes qué? Me parece súper interesante lo que estás presentando, pero me queda una duda respecto a lo metodológico, que a lo mejor lo tienes considerado, pero como no lo mencionaste, me saltó la duda. ¿Tú tienes considerado, después de la implementación y la aplicación del test, o sea, y la implementación de la propuesta tuya, la medición de la magnitud de efecto para verificar que efectivamente los resultados están asociados a la intervención y no a algún efecto de azar u otra cosa?
Pues, Paula, gracias. Estoy apuntando ahora magnitud de efecto para investigar, porque lo cierto es que también estoy muy verde. Estoy ahora diseñando la investigación y luego la parte de validación tendré que ver cómo funciona.
Dale, te lo menciono porque desde el punto de vista estadístico es súper importante. Es lo que yo he leído, porque yo también estoy trabajando en el diseño de instrumentos, entonces ahí hay un elemento. Entonces, el tema de las intervenciones, para que tenga validez efectiva y para probar que hay una correlación entre la intervención y los resultados que te arroje el test, tiene que haber una medición de efecto para que tú puedas establecer esa correlación. De lo contrario, en realidad podría ser asociado a cualquier otra cosa, cualquier otro elemento del entorno. Entonces, que esa es una cosa que a lo mejor tu tribunal después te podría como cuestionar. Entonces, que no te pillen de sorpresa y tenlo en cuenta. Solo eso.
Pues muchísimas gracias. La suerte o desgracia que tengo es que tanto mi director de tesis, bueno, tengo dos, directora de tesis, los dos son unos frikis del mundo estadístico que sé que me van a meter mucha caña. Entonces, por la parte tribunal, voy tranquilo porque los monstruos los tengo antes, pero a su vez voy a aprovechar esto que me has dicho, Paula, para llegar a ellos y parecer que sé algo más de estadística de lo que sé. Así que,
¿Quiénes son?
José Manuel García Ramos y Noemí Martín, que es de la Francisco Victoria. Y los dos, eso, típico de metodologías cuantitativas de estadística, pues es su tema. Entonces, bueno, me metes acá. Aprovecho, ¿alguna pregunta más?
Sí, Piedad. ¿Quieres poner el micro, Piedad?
Hola, ¿qué tal? Bueno, espera, voy a poner la cámara, aunque yo esto...
No te vamos a ver, no hace falta.
Bueno, no pasa nada. Nada, yo sobre todo quería hacerte preguntas, lo que no sé si has acabado ya la exposición o te hemos interrumpido aquí a la mitad.
Está, yo creo ya...
¿Quieres esperar, quieres acabar y ya te comentamos?
No, porque creo que es más interesante si yo, aunque no lo haya dicho, pero que lo diga a raíz de tu pregunta.
Vale, a mí me gustaría, o sea, como creo que lo más interesante quizá sería entender un poco en algún punto como cuál es tu concepción de la creatividad. O sea, porque entiendo que es una concepción muy integradora, ¿no? Como que entiende que no estamos hablando solo de creatividad, vamos, como se conoce normalmente o lo que suele asociar la gente de creatividad con toda la cuestión de aptitud artística, etcétera, sino que también es vamos, que es una visión mucho más amplia, presupongo. Y bueno, no sé, comentarte simplemente que aquí en la facultad hay varias asignaturas que son precisamente de creatividad y de creatividad y educación o creatividad y arte. Y bueno, en concreto estoy pensando en Julio Romero, que es una persona que la ha dado durante muchos años, la da también en máster. Y bueno, que es pues, una mirada que desafía bastante lo que creemos que es creatividad o no. Entonces creo que ahí eso te podría venir bien. Creo que sí, que me gustaría preguntarte también sobre tu concepción de la creatividad o cuál es un poco o no sé si es demasiado complejo esto.
No, vamos, a mí me encanta porque en el fondo ahora lo que estás explicando es la tesis como desde el continente, pero no el contenido.
Vale.
El contenido me gusta mucho más. ¿Qué pasa? Mi visión. La creatividad, como lo has dicho, no solo se limita al ámbito artístico, sino que entendemos por creatividad o pensamiento creativo una capacidad que nos sirve para combinar, hacer conexiones y generar un resultado original y novedoso.
Genial.
Pero, ¿qué pasa? Esto es la definición. La definición se queda muy corta y ahora sí aprovecho tu pregunta, Piedad, para decir que cuando hablamos de creatividad tenemos por un lado el pensamiento divergente, que es con lo que más se suele confundir, que es este ejercicio que decía de brainstorming, venga, pensamiento salvaje, todo lo que se te ocurra y eso es creativo. Pero también hay mucho más, que es el pensamiento convergente y lo hablaba ahora con Guillermo, la creatividad narrativa. Es decir, la capacidad que tenemos de proyectar y de imaginar, pues por ejemplo, una serie policíaca, ¿quién ha podido matar a este? O una de detectives. Imaginarnos ese escenario, ya estamos aplicando unos procesos que ya entran en la categoría de creatividad. Entonces, es mucho más complejo de esto. Y aprovecho que tengo también, soy un afortunado, pero salió hace, no sé si 6, 7 meses, el informe PISA de 2022 abierto, que es la primera vez que han medido el pensamiento creativo. Entonces, está fenomenal que ya no soy yo el iluminado que va a definir qué es el pensamiento creativo y la creatividad, sino que ya hay estas instituciones grandes que se han metido a ello. Aún así, yo contesto a esta pregunta diciendo que no es arte, no es solo el arte, simplemente en el arte encontramos creatividad, pero en la ciencia e investigación también encontramos creatividad.
Y en el deporte, en todo, sí.
También de hipótesis y encontramos creatividad en nuestro día a día. Entonces, bueno, que se habla mucho de creatividad con C minúscula, como esa creatividad cotidiana y que vamos haciendo sin darnos cuenta en esos procesos cognitivos, y por otro lado de esa creatividad mayúscula que es la que se habla en ese arte como el desvelamiento de la realidad. En cualquier caso, las dos cosas son lo mismo y para que nos entendamos es hacer unas conexiones en nuestro cerebro que están generando unas ideas que normalmente no han sido generadas, ¿vale? Entonces, si es 2 más 2, 4, hay cero creatividad. Si os pregunto cómo cruzarías el río y vamos generando respuestas distintas, ahí ya, ante un problema nuevo, estamos generando unas respuestas novedosas y originales.
Muchas gracias. Yo es que hice mi TFG sobre la creatividad también. Entonces, por eso que me interesa mucho. Entonces, cuando vayas avanzando, si quieres estar en comunicación, yo encantada de aprender de las novedades que tú, porque ahora... vamos, que estás actualizando esta búsqueda, entonces, eso, nada, que mucha suerte para tu trabajo.
Gracias.
Julio, tiene otra pregunta.
Muy buenas tardes, noches en Madrid, espero que estén muy bien. Aquí escuchando atentamente el proyecto relacionado con la creatividad. Me surge una pregunta y es en razón a cómo, de alguna otra manera, digamos, miraba que se va a intentar como hacer un instrumento para estandarizar la creatividad. Cuando uno se para, por ejemplo, sobre la perspectiva teórica de Vygotsky sobre la imaginación, él, digamos, toma y tiene muy en cuenta todo el factor cultural. Mi pregunta es realmente relacionada con eso, o sea, ¿cómo se va a tener en cuenta el valor cultural de la investigación, de la creatividad en la investigación, teniendo en cuenta qué parte de la creatividad se construye desde la experiencia enriquecida? Y sabemos que hay unos factores culturales que inciden en la manera como se constituye y de manera individual se percibe la creatividad. Entonces, esa es mi pregunta frente al proyecto.
Julio, ¿no?
Sí.
Sí, señor, Julio.
Sí, me parece muy buena pregunta y para que sepamos un poco dónde estamos, también contextualizo un poco. Cuando hablamos de creatividad, es esa capacidad de combinar esas ideas, pero como os podéis imaginar, el resultado que vas a dar va a ser, o tienes más posibilidad de dar distintos resultados cuando tienes muchas ideas que cuando tienes pocas, ¿vale? Todo esto es para que veáis, si al final vamos a ver cuántos puzzles somos capaces de hacer con las piezas que tenemos, si tenemos más piezas, tendremos más posibilidad de hacer puzzles. Con todo esto, os lo digo también para vincular que la creatividad ya no es ahora aprendizaje por competencias, no, es que también requiere de un contenido, de unos conocimientos, porque cuando conoces algo es lo que luego te permite avanzar. Todo esto lo conecto con la parte cultural, porque como decía Julio, cada uno estamos atravesados por una cultura y venimos de nuestro padre y de nuestra madre, y eso de una forma u otra nos está afectando. Entonces, a mí me preocupó al principio cuando estaba midiendo la creatividad, porque en función del nivel de conocimientos contenidos sobre algo puede generar un mejor o peor resultado. Entonces, ese fue el primer miedo de, no sé si estoy evaluando la creatividad o estoy evaluando el conocimiento previo que tienen y, por tanto, ¿sabéis cómo? Estoy valorando las piezas del puzzle y no la capacidad de construirlo. ¿Qué pasa? Que por suerte esto no se me había ocurrido, esta preocupación no es solo mía, sino que la han compartido más investigadores y lo que hacen es tener muchísimo cuidado en las pruebas que se hacen para evitar cualquier tipo de sesgo cultural. Entonces, ¿puede que lo haya? Es posible, pero se están haciendo desde estas pruebas, como os decía, el de la botella es un caso real, como este es un test. Y todos, de una forma u otra, tenemos una concepción de la cultura de la botella y estamos familiarizados con ella, o con un ladrillo. Son objetos cotidianos que a su vez la cultura nos puede llevar a producir. Pues si somos españoles decimos, hombre, la llenamos de vino tinto y yo qué sé. Lo que quiero decir es que al final va a ser muy interesante ver diferencias culturales a la hora de evaluar los resultados, pero creo que en este tipo de test ya se ha tenido en cuenta el posible sesgo cultural y por lo que yo he estado leyendo de literatura, se está evitando. No sé si te respondo más o menos. En cualquier caso, apuntadísimo, imaginación, Vygotsky. Esto sí que me interesa. Lo acabo de contar, ¿vale? A nivel de contribución, mi idea es ir de forma escalonada, paso a paso. Empezar con este tipo de intervención, que sea una intervención general, para que durante esas 4 semanas, que luego se puede ir ampliando, los estudiantes que pasen por esto vayan llevándose una serie de técnicas y de formas que les ayuden a pensar de forma creativa. Que sepan cuándo se piensa de forma creativa y cómo pensar a través de estas herramientas. ¿Qué pasa? De nuevo también mi director de tesis lo que dice es, hombre, no, pero esto lo que hay que hacer es aplicarlo en asignaturas directamente. Y a mí esto me da bastante yuyu porque no sé cuál va a ser la validez de esto o el nivel de adaptación en matemáticas, en historia, en neurobiología. Entonces, bueno, me lo pongo como primer paso, diseño de un programa. Paso, ya no sé si esto será después de la tesis, buscar qué asignaturas tienen mejor aceptación de este tipo de herramientas y cuáles pues tienen un pensamiento, bueno, unas necesidades más restrictivas y pueden encajar peor. Y a su vez, y ya pensando en mi propósito, para mí todo esto tiene sentido en el momento que vuelve a mis estudiantes de Villaverde, estamos en secundaria y estamos aplicándolo a personas con unos niveles de desmotivación y desvinculación con su aprendizaje bastante grandes. Entonces, bueno, como que me estoy desviando un poco el camino, pero para luego volver. Así que, bueno, a nivel de propósito, que sepáis esto. Y las limitaciones ya las sigo comentando. Selección de la muestra, que no va a ser aleatoria. La duración de la intervención, en mi opinión, es corta. Y luego la edición del compromiso académico, no sé cuántos estáis familiarizados, pero son unos cuestionarios de autopercepción. Entonces, también no sé hasta qué punto podemos sacar grandes conclusiones cuando se trata de estos cuestionarios de autopercepción, que son 15 ítems, que pues puede que los estudiantes los contesten un poco al azar o directamente afecten muchísimo más su percepción de cómo están en ese día o las ganas que tengan de salir cuando hacemos los cuestionarios, que este es otro tema que ya he ido observando y me asusta un poco, que es el nivel de seriedad que se puede tomar este tipo de cuestionarios. No así, por cierto, aprovecho, cuando son las pruebas de creatividad, que se lo pasa muy bien porque es jugar. Y nada, por mi parte esto es todo. Así que os diría que si tenéis cualquier duda, comentario, crítica, me encanta llevarme hojas para seguir trabajando.
Ahora que mencionaste el juego, lo pensaba también porque justo Pablo yo no tenía idea, me dijo que esto de la alineación es algo relacional, ¿no? Con lo que
la alineación.
Alienación.
Claro. Entonces también pienso en eso, como la creatividad y ahora existe el juego. Se implica también que van a interactuar también, porque pienso en la creatividad también como una posibilidad de intervenirse socialmente distinto, y bueno, ahí también quizás pensado, se abre como una ventana de cuánto también esa red aporta también a lo académico, que es también lo que estáis.
Total, aquí mira, creo que un poco la academia no sé si nos limita o nos restringe, o es la Francisco Victoria, ahí habrá que ver. Pero cuando se habla de creatividad o de juego, el ambiente afecta muchísimo. El ambiente, como el entorno que se está, en el que se está ejerciendo, pero también los compañeros y compañeras. Y en este sentido se habla como la diversidad de perfiles, cómo puede generar unos resultados más creativos. Es decir, suele crear unos resultados más creativos. Entonces, ¿qué es lo complicado que veo yo esto? Por un lado, pienso, a nivel de hacer intervención, habrá actividades individuales, habrá actividades grupales, y las grupales creo que van a ser súper necesarias. Ahora bien, imagínate, ¿cuál es tu nombre, perdón? Ricardo, que yo cuando estoy contigo soy la leche de creativo y me genera muchísima inspiración. Creo que luego cuando estamos midiendo hay que ver si hace falta que esté Ricardo delante para que yo genere esos resultados que van a ver el potencial. ¿Sabéis cómo cuál va a ser la dependencia que voy a tener de ti? Me parece súper interesante esto, ¿eh?
Claro, o sea, la dependencia, claro, sí. Que al final también es lo triste, opino yo, que al final las calificaciones y la evaluación académica es muy individualista al final. Y también es maravilloso que pueda haber alguien que me ayude, ¿no? O sea, igual es, no sé, como lo social también es...
No, me quedo con esta, ¿eh?
Con eso,
que es fundamental, que el aprendizaje es social, es cooperativo y el aprendizaje no solo de contenidos, también de desarrollo de competencias. Entonces, creo que hacia lo que hay que perseguir es el entrenamiento, intervención educativa. Vamos a favorecer esta colaboración, esta cooperación en este juegos dinámicas. Ahora bien, a la hora de evaluar, luego hay que ver cómo ese grupo, esa actividad grupal, ha enriquecido individualmente el desarrollo del pensamiento creativo de cada individuo, ¿vale? Porque al final es un poco lo que estamos limitados para medir el desarrollo.
Sí, bueno, eso también lo encuentro muy bueno de lo que de tu propuesta, que también lo podéis quizá incluir, pensar, como lo académico, pero también el bienestar del grupo. Entonces quizás como, claro, lo académico se mantiene, pero te reportan que se sienten mucho más cómodos entre ellos, que la hostilidad social bajó, no sé, producto de los juegos, como puede transformarse algo en el aula que...
Total, una variable para correlacionar es el ambiente de aula, sí.
Luego es cierto que seguramente tengas que tomar decisiones, ¿no? Ahora te van a venir y en el camino otras oportunidades, ¿no? De futuras investigaciones o presenten, pero luego hay que tomar decisiones. Yo he comentado así con Ricardo también en un momento que en tu introducción, cuando hablabas de esta idea de individuo alineado por el contexto, ¿no? Y luego la creatividad se ha enfocado desde un punto más individual, en el que está la responsabilidad individual de cada uno y esa evaluación, ¿no? Entonces, a partir de esa introducción, pues viendo esa narrativa desconstruida así de forma muy breve, al inicio me había algo que no seguía la continuidad, pero bueno, poniendo todo tu planteamiento, la verdad que tiene muy buena pinta, pero hay mucho trabajo ahí también.
Sí. No, pero has dado un punto que me parece súper interesante, que es, yo cuando hablaba de alienación era como, mirar, desde esto no me viene la semana pasada, sino que ya el perseguir y tratar de entender que no se evita ese desarrollo ya me obsesionaba en la carrera. Lo curioso de esto es, en la carrera iba mucho más en lo social y ahora exactamente lo mismo, sigue siendo lo social por este último punto que digo, que es ¿por qué mis estudiantes de Villaverde siento que muestran unos niveles más bajos de creatividad que no los estudiantes universitarios de la universidad privada en la que luego estoy? Entonces, sí que sigue estando, lo que pasa que el punto desde lo que abordo antes era voy a entender las causas sociales, ahora, y eso era más la filosofía social, ahora estoy más, voy a entender más el desarrollo individual de cada uno para ver cómo se puede tirar para arriba. Sí.
Con este programa que potencia este pensamiento creativo.
Sí, pero vamos, no me atrevo a hablar de alienación en la tesis y yo creo que me echan de la Francisco Vitoria. Bueno, ahora hago así salto. Sí. Pues, bueno, ¿alguna pregunta más? Por mi parte es todo. Así que muchas gracias, que me llevo 8 cosas para seguir ahí profundizando.
Muchísimas gracias a ti por haberte animado aquí a exponer y por haber traído un tema tan interesante y también por aceptar tan bien todos los comentarios y sugerencias, porque creo que aprendemos mucho. Yo te quería preguntar una cosa más antes, que es qué lecturas o qué referencias tienes en mente.
Wow. Hay muchas, ¿eh? Quiero decir, creo que uno de los retos principales que tengo, bueno, son dos. El primero, el orden, porque no sé si os ha pasado, vosotros que lleváis más, yo no sé cuántos papers tengo, que si en Zotero, luego en un Excel que voy comentando, unos guardados en el Drive, otros en mi ordenador. Entonces, es salvaje la cantidad de literatura que hay, sobre todo cuando hablamos de un tema como creatividad, que todo el mundo trata de forma que toca, pero nadie es como, ¡fum!, me centro solo en esto. No desvío tu pregunta. Ahora, lecturas sobre este tema.
Bueno, te lo pregunto porque veo que tiene un enfoque que podría ser muy interesante, teórico, fuerte, y pues desde la revisión un poco más clásica, ¿no?, de cómo se ha gestado el concepto de creatividad, de imaginación, y luego cómo eso aterriza. Entonces, pues a ver si te ibas a meter ahí en ese...
Sí, mi idea es meterme ahí, ya estoy un poco en ello, y lo que pasa es que siento que he destapado muchísima literatura sobre el tema y a la vez no he tenido tiempo para digerir estas cosas. Entonces, creo que tendré que tomar, bueno, pero no, sé que voy a tener que tomar un posicionamiento también ideológico en cierto modo y todavía estoy trabajando en ello. Y para que veáis el posicionamiento ideológico me refiero a que la creatividad tú puedes medir la cantidad de ideas, pero puedes medir también la novedad de las ideas, puedes medir también el valor que generan esas ideas, pues por ejemplo hay en el mercado y dices, oye, aquí ya hay un posicionamiento, la transformación del sujeto creativo con el mismo, que te da, mira, un poco de dialéctica, tal. Entonces, en función de los indicadores que tomes, que no son pocos, ya te estás posicionando inevitablemente. Por ahora voy a coger lo que os comentaba con Guillermo, un espectro amplio de, pues, este que me da pensamiento divergente, este que me da originalidad y nivel de concreción y elaboración, este que me da tipo de narración contrafactual, este que me da... entonces, voy haciendo una especie de abanico para como no dejar a nada atrás y luego ya veremos con los resultados.
Vale. Bueno, pues muchísimo ánimo con esta tarea. Estás en primero, ¿no?
Sí.
Ánimo también con los complementos formativos y con la semana esta que tenemos en mayo, ¿no?, de formación, pero bueno, es una buena oportunidad para conocer a tus compañeros. Y nada, pues con esto damos clausura. Te damos muchas gracias de que te hayas animado. Y bueno, voy a poner ahí también para avisar. Con esto cerramos ya el seminario de hoy y mañana volvemos a tener sesión, una sesión extra de mano de los compañeros de Salud Digital.
que nuestro compañero habla mañana junto a una persona visitante que viene justo. Y nada, os animamos también a que vengáis. Va a haber una sesión online. Lo que pasa es que, todos los organizadores nos han recomendado que vengáis presencial, porque va a haber talleres, va a haber un taller de trabajar en grupo, en parejas y en presencial. Entonces os animamos mucho a que si podéis, que os acerquéis, que merece mucho la pena. Y nada, para marzo también tenemos otra sesión, que ya adelantamos que será para el día 18. Y poco más. Muchas gracias por venir, muchas gracias por haber aguantado a pesar de las horas, y mucho ánimo con la tesis. Y nada, estamos aquí. Cualquier cosa que necesitéis, como tarde, nos vemos en el Kids Day. Hasta luego.